Hi everybody, welcome to today's webinar. We are going to talk about open to open source collections management systems. I am Rachel Woody, and you'll notice I'm not here with Andre. Unfortunately, he could not meet his commitment with us today. So we will miss him, but no, not to worry. This group project has turned into a solo project, and I do intend and will cover all of the content that we have decided on today. So without further ado, let's get into it. For those who are new to me, new to the webinars, I am Rachel Woody. I am the owner of Rachael Christine Consulting, and I'm a firm that serves libraries, archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations. My expertise is in digital collections management, which means that I have specialized in digitization technology, digital project management, and digital usership. And with that, I have launched multiple digital projects, many that include cutting-edge technology, collaborative portals, and the migration of collections content into collections management systems. Couple housekeeping items before we get started. This session is pre-recorded so that I can deliver the maximum amount of information to you. This also allows me to follow up with questions in the chat box, drop resource links, that kind of thing. Also, this webinar is recorded, so the next day after this webinar premieres, you will receive a link to the recording and can check it out again and share as you see fit. While we are doing this presentation, if you are joining us live for the premiere, please feel free to share your own examples, resources, questions in the chat box as we go along. And just a note to please remember that all of what's presented today is under my copyright, and to please respect that. So here is a note about the screen that you're viewing. If you're with us in the webinar room, sometimes that little webinar window is a little too small for your liking. There is the option to do full screen when you hover over the bottom menu there. There's also an icon here to view closed captioning, because there are auto captioning available for these videos. And also, I'll drop a link, but this video is also premiering in YouTube. So if you prefer to view it in your Chrome or whatever browser on YouTube, you can also do that. So here's what we're going to cover today. It's a full agenda. We are going to talk about the free and open source product options and what's the difference. We're going to talk about coding resources for the brave and adventurous. We'll talk about what costs are associated with open source, even if they are free. We will then review how to evaluate and choose a product that makes sense for you. And then, of course, having a discussion on how to set up an open source CMS with capacity and sustainability in mind, because of course, it will take a bit more work than using a proprietary product. And then how to make the case to your boss, particularly if they are not really familiar with what a collections management system does or what open source means. I do have a few tips and strategies for you to take back home with you. So getting into it, free and open source product options for collections management systems. First, just so that we're all working from the same definition, open source is, according to Oxford Dictionary, it denotes software for which the original source code is made freely available and may be redistributed and modified. So the code is out there, you can download it, use it, modify it, build on it, what have you. That's the idea of it being open. The code is available, transparent, all of that. So that is why it is called open source. Does open source mean free? And this is particularly important because cost, of course, will be coming up a couple times in today's webinar. And no, it is not a 100% all open source equals free. Many of them do happen to be free. Others offer, typically it's a tiered paid version system, where the code itself, of course, is free, but you can then buy into and purchase services that could help support do the software implementation, and of course, any maintenance. So um, while the product may be free, the stuff that comes with it and actually using it could have a price attached to it. And then also, you can implement a free and open source product and still choose to pay a different hosting vendor to implement, actually host it, and manage it. And we will get into an example of that in just a minute. And just a note here, we are not going to talk about proprietary products beyond this one slide, but I did want to clarify that there are um, free products that are proprietary and not open source. So just like how not all open source products are free, not all free products are open source. So in this case, for vendors who offer software as a service, they do have some what we call freemium models, which I'll give you an example of in just a moment. But freemium is a portmanteau of free and premium. And the freemium model is one that you'll see exercised throughout our existence online, where a particular product has, you can create a free account and you can use some of the basic functionality. But the moment you want to use additional features or have access to more tools or server space, etc., there are additional premiums you would then have to pay into to have that be accessible to you. So one of those examples is Preservica, who made a lot of headlines this last year when they announced their Preservica Starter Edition and had a starter membership that is $0 per month. So you can get in, you can start using the Preservica platform. It's very bare bones, but it's free. And then if you wanted to build on that, as once you decide the product is for you, because of course that's their hope when you use, when you're able to do the freemium model, is that you get hooked on it and you want more. And so you can then, of course, increase your investment from $0 to, in this case, the next step up is almost $200 per month to start accessing much more sizable, in this case, user licenses and storage space. And for many others, that can also mean additional tools and features as well. So that is an example of a proprietary, not open source product, but does happen to have a free version. Okay, back to open source. Lyrasis is an example of an external vendor who hosts open source CMS products. So the collections management system products that you see on this slide, archive space, collection space, DSpace, etc., Lyrasis did not necessarily create the foundational pieces of these open source collections management system products. However, they are selling their services as a host provider to, for any of these products that you choose on the site. They would install it for you, customize it, get it set up. They'll help you manage it, help you troubleshoot, all of that kind of stuff. So if you're particularly in a situation where you are interested in open source for a variety of reasons, and you have a somewhat modest budget to help you invest and manage this open source product, working with a hosting service like Lyrasis may be a good option for you to help do that technical side of it, and still keep it budget friendly. So that is just one example of several hosting sources out there you could use. So to give you some names and products, I do have a couple slides that we'll talk about archives, museums, and multi-collection types of open source products. This is by no means exhaustive. Also keep in mind that there are many products out there that used to exist but have either been folded into a new product, subsumed by a new product, or have just died. That is one of the risks slash consequences of using open source. If there is a robust user community, that's great. The open source product is healthy and will stay around for a while and continue to be updated and evolve. However, if that community is not robust, it's not healthy, you run the risk of it dying. And it dying means there's no longer any updates, it's no longer being built or supported upon by anybody, and that eventually you may start losing access to your items, to the features of that particular product. So there are several products we used to use. For example, Archivist Toolkit is one of them that now no longer is supported. And in many cases, Archive Space became the subsuming product for that. So, however, if there are open source products that I didn't include in here that you know are alive and well, please feel free to drop them in the chat and share them with everyone, because the more information, the better. So, open source products for archival collections, the two most common that I see in practice are archive space and access to memory, which you will most often hear referred to by the acronym ATOM. And then, of course, there's Islandora, which when you go down that particular rabbit hole, Islandora is actually made up of several different open source products. For example, I think Drupal and Fedora are at least two of those in its foundation. And so Islandora is actually a wonderful example of how complex a particular open source product can be by building on a foundation of other open source products. Getting into open source for museum collections, collective access, collection space, and Omeka or Omeka, whatever your pronunciation preference is. Those are all primarily for museum collections management systems. However, all three do speak to, at least on their websites, to supporting archival collections as well. I have, for the three products on this particular slide, I have seen those in action to varying extents. Um, the ones that I think have been most successful in incorporating both of the collections has been collective access and collection space. But I do know the Omeka community has been working on trying to more better manage and represent archival collections as well. So they all, to varying extents, will support both collections, even though they may have initially been museum only. All right. Additional open source options that tend to be more multi-collection options or not necessarily archive or museum options. So, for example, Samvera, which was formerly Hydra, is one of those that has a variety of functions that it can do. For example, it does do basic collections management operations, but also I believe it has a aspect of it for institutional repository type collections. The next one, DSpace, that is primarily institutional repository based. Internet Archive slash Archiveit. This is an example of where Archiveit, the majority of the code and foundation was built on open source, even though Internet Archive owns Archiveit. So that's one of those use cases there. There's also for cultural heritage collections, and specifically for the Native American community here, there is what is pronounced Mukutu, where this particular product does have collections management functionality, but also because it was created with those cultural heritage collections in mind, it has cultural protocols, the correct TK acronym for being able to label things accurately versus the traditional more colonialist or ethnographic naming of items. So we've got more accurate original naming based on community names in this particular system. So for collections that are geared towards that type of cultural heritage, that is a great product to use. And then we're starting to see things pop up like Tainacan, which is Portuguese, so I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but Tainacan is a plugin for WordPress, which is a collections management system plugin that you can then use with your WordPress website. So it's bringing in a collections management system aspect to your website, which is fascinating to me. So I'm keeping an eye on that one. And then I did have at least a couple of you ask me about open source for digital preservation as well, which especially this last year is becoming a more frequent question and request I am receiving. is how can we get a collections management system that also includes digital preservation aspects? I have yet to see like a one size fits all or like a one to rule them all kind of system, but we are working our way there, which is exciting. But for now, and specifically for digital preservation, Archivematica and Fedora are the two most common that I see in terms of open source products being used for digital preservation. There's also the option for you where if you go and get, for example, maybe you get archivist or archive space for your collections management system. You can then also pair that with something like Archivematica or Fedora to get that digital preservation piece. That does, of course, take extra knowledge and ability to connect those systems together, but that is an option. To get more names and examples for digital preservation, I do want to point out there's a registry out there. It's called Community Owned Digital Preservation Tool Registry, or COPTER. And then one of the specific tools, and one that I use heavily, is the Digital Power Tool Evaluation Grid, and that's Power, POWRR. And there's a snapshot of this tool grid from their website, and one of their columns here tracks whether or not these digital preservation products are open source. So when you go to this website, you can go check out the dozens of products that they have looked into. Not all of them have a collections management aspect, but if you're just interested in digital preservation, you can see how well they score up and whether or not they're open source. So this is a great area to go check out for that. All right, coding for the brave and adventurous. And I mean this in a very complimentary fashion. For those who are interested, I love that you are still continuing to learn and challenge yourself, because this is absolutely a skill set that will be valuable to you no matter where you are working. So if you are interested, let's dive into some of this technical stuff for a moment. Most open source runs on a Linux operating system, which is an open source technology, and it is going to require some basic coding knowledge and being able to operate via command, or what I more commonly hear referred to as command line coding. So with that in mind, you also need to know what a Git is, Git, and how to get it. So there's this great article by LifeWire. There are many resources out there, but you can certainly start with this one. But it explains that Git is a software that tracks changes to any set of files and is used to help coordinate work among a variety of programmers and coders working collaboratively to develop open source products. And the good news here is that to get a Git, Git, it's free and open source, of course. I did not mean to intentionally rhyme there. And you can get it for Windows users and Mac users. So it doesn't matter what sort of computer you're using, you can get it. And of course, coding classes. And there are so many good ones that are available for free. The one I'm going to highlight right now is from GitHub, the GIT GitHub. And they've got a whole learning lab feature, and you can do their starter courses for free. So GitHub is basically a library for like many open source products available, not just collections management systems. And so it's a great place to go to learn about it, because that's probably also where you would get and download whatever open source product it is that you have chosen. So GitHub is a great place to go, not just for the open source products, but also to do any sort of coding and learning. Go check out their learning lab for free and paid courses. Okay, so how much will open source cost? Let's get into it. So open source, as we discussed previously, many are free. Not all of them, but many are initially free. So the only thing in that case, if you're the one doing it, is factoring in the do-it-yourself cost. So that would be the cost of of your time and possibly the cost of any sort of classes that you might be taking to not only learn how to install the product, but also customize and manage it. If you are not the person who will be doing that, and if you intend to contract out, whether that is with a web developer, whether that's with a digital archivist who also knows open source coding systems, or working with an actual vendor host like Lyrasis, there are costs with that, of course. So, thinking about contracting out for just the setup, it's going to vary. And if this is one of those asterisks, it depends situations where if you are just looking for like a basic installation, not a lot of bells and whistles, maybe you're installing a couple additional plugins that are optional, but you're not doing any customization, you can keep the costs fairly low. And for example, in fact, it probably would be more expensive to pay for how much server space you're taking up for the database and your items than it would necessarily be for the cost of them installing it. So for that, anywhere from 500 to like 5,000 for that initial installation, again, depending on like how much server space you need and how much customization you want. If you are looking at extensive customization, and that could be extensive on the back end, building in plugins and features that you want, and that could be on the front end, helping to make it prettier, more engaging, etc. That, of course, is going to take time and cost money. And so then you're going to start getting into the $10,000 plus range. You're probably pretty solid at 10,000 unless you're adding on partners and or this is a collaborative portal, that kind of thing. That's all going to increase your cost. And then, of course, the annual contract. Even though you may only need to install it once, if you are using any server space, there will most likely be an annual cost for that. Also, if you are entering into a contract with a vendor or a consultant, there may be annual updates or services provided for troubleshooting and support, that kind of thing. If you're opting to have that level of support, you are looking at an annual contract. It could be less than 5,000 depending on your size and use, but to be safe, budget for that $5,000 to $10,000 range so that you have room to get a qualified person who then has the time and the money to do what you need them to do. How to evaluate and choose a product. So there are a lot of excuse me, there are a lot of product options out there, even when you've got it narrowed down to open source. And especially because it's open source, there are a lot of options that come with varying areas of focus, whether it's just archives, multi-collection, etc. So we need to be very thoughtful and intentional in terms of which open product you choose. So I have some tips for you to help evaluate. First, determine the resources that you have available, and resources could be staff and capacity of staff, the technical aptitude of the employees you have access to, and or the money available to support implementation and management of your open source product. Second would be to document and evaluate all of the workflows that you are doing currently and identifying key functionality of areas that need to be supported by your open source product. So making sure you're documenting those, even if you don't currently have a collections management system, sit down and really think out what that workflow will look like once you do have one, and to the best of your ability, identify the functionality that would help make your job easier and support the collections better. Next would be to identify what collection types are involved and therefore the best practices. For example, if you are just working with an archives collection in that open source product and only archives, don't need to worry about anything else, then you only need to worry about the archives best practices. And so you may want to see Dublin core fields supported, and that also support describing archives, a content standard, DAX, supporting DAX best practices. If you are doing a hybrid collection type, then you'll need an open source product that could support or toggle between, okay, you're doing an archives entry, you want to use Dublin core and DAX standards versus the museum schema and standards. So That's important to identify ahead of time before you select a product. And then, of course, establish and prioritize specifications with all stakeholders. So, anybody who would be using the collections management system, whether it's the back end or the front end, what they're using it for, what they need out of it, and making sure that that's captured in the specifications you create that will be used as an evaluation tool when you're looking at your open source products. And then you get into making that decision, how to choose. Rank each open source product against the specifications grid that you have created in order to determine best fit. And this is an exercise you would do whether you're procuring a proprietary system or an open source system. So this is best practice no matter what the price tag is. Also, ensure that your choice can be sustained by staff and or outside vendors slash consultants. So if the staff are the ones supporting it from the onset, you need to know that, and they need to be able to do it. Or if you are going to be working with outside vendors, that needs to be a commitment. There needs to be a budget involved with that. That needs to be known before you choose a product. And then confirm that the choice is affordable with the tangible and intangible costs. So again, while open source products may be free, there are costs associated with them, whether that's the cost of your time and expertise in doing the work of installing it and managing it, or whether that is the literal cost you're paying to a vendor or consultant to help do that work for you. Setting up with capacity and sustainability in mind. And this is particularly important when we're looking at open source products because they can be more labor intensive given their nature and for all of the reasons we just talked about. So, in order to successfully implement an open source product for your organization, it has to be a good fit. And if you choose a free and open source product, you need to determine ahead of time what it will cost in terms of staff time and expertise. So, those were part of our decision making factors, and we need to make sure that we stay cognizant of them and periodically review them to make sure that we are still maintaining capacity to support this collections management system. With that in mind, there must be staff in place who have that time, knowledge, and expertise, that capacity to not only implement and install the open source product, but to then maintain it, especially if you're proceeding without a vendor or consultant. And if staff changes, and particularly for the worse, if you lose the person who had that knowledge and capability to work with open source, then you need to have a backup plan in place and some idea of what it will cost to work with somebody to bring them in, even if it's short term, and having a backup plan to access that money. Because once you do lose that employee, it could be very bad news, especially if your particular open source product needs to be updated, if there is, for example, maybe a security issue or a functionality issue. So make sure you know what your backup plan is going to look like before you need it. And of course, sustainability. So, how can we sustain the support of this open source product, not just for when we implement, but for years and years as you're using it? So, some of the tips for keeping this sustainable is to avoid customizations that will be difficult for you to maintain without the right support. So, if you have a vendor or consultant and you've got a fairly healthy and dependable budget line for that person, great. Maybe you don't need to worry about it. But if it's you, for example, who might be the person that they rely on to do all of that work, then making minimal customizations is the better call here. Unless you happen to be an open source coding savant, then I leave that to you. Next tip, determine what resources are available annually to support the costs associated for staff, the product, the vendor, consultant, etc. So make sure that there is a budget line. Even though this product is free, you still need money to support it. Include a budget of time and the money to facilitate, whether that is for you to do staff training or to hire that ad hoc consultant. So, particularly if it's you or staff in-house that are doing this maintenance work, getting regular trainings for doing that is so important and will make your jobs so much easier. So make sure that there's time and money and the allowance for that to happen. And then conduct regular, annual at least, checks to evaluate the fit of the open source product that you chose and to make a determination if an upgrade or a change is needed. So as we discussed previously, open source products by their very nature are continuing to evolve, in most cases for the better, but in some cases, communities go away, there's a bigger, better product, what have you. You need to make sure that you stay aware of the health of the open source product that you're using so that it doesn't catch you by surprise if it dies or starts being sunsetted. Because if that happens, you have to find a way to quickly extract all of your digital assets and the metadata that goes with it and find a new system. And nobody wants to do that in a rush with a system that's already dead. How to make the case to your boss. So for any sort of collections management system, there's usually always that having to make a case to your boss. But there is an added layer of difficulty here when you are considering an open source product. For some of you, the dilemma or the challenge may be that your boss is very into open source products because they believe open source equals free and that it will just be a nice, free, easy option. Of course, we know from this webinar that is not true, and so there needs to be some education that happens with your boss in terms of what needs to be in place to support the free open source product and how those supports aren't free. Uh, Conversely, if you have a boss who is aware of those costs or who may be overwhelmed, maybe intimidated by the idea of doing an open source product, there then needs to be some education in terms of the supports that are available for you to bring in an open source product, what the costs are associated with that, but also that it is possible, assuming you have the right supports in place. So with that in mind, I have a few tips and strategies for you to make the case to your boss for an open source collections management system. First one, explain what a collections management system is and its role in the museum/archives if needed. Hopefully in your organizations that's not needed, but I have been in plenty of situations where the museum director or the board or whomever do need a little bit of education in terms of what a CMS does and why it is so critical for your job and the effective management of collections. The next step is to explain what open source means and what the options are available in terms of technical support. So this would be bringing in examples of hosting services like Lyricist and or consultants and contractors that could help. Next, outline what exists currently and demonstrate with numbers or narrative how no or a bad CMS is impacting object care and management. So giving some examples of how it could help make your job easier or better is usually a great way to go from a persuasion perspective. Another good persuasion tool is to highlight peer use cases of those who use open source CMS products as an example of how good it could look and how well it can operate. And then provide a budget and logistic details that need to be considered and planned for. So again, hosting vendors, the training, if you're doing it yourself or your staff, getting regular training for that. And then of course making the actual ask. And while that can certainly be done verbally, I have found usually written down is a great best practice so that it is easy to follow up on, and it's also easy to provide whoever the decision maker is all of the details that they need to reference to make an informed decision. A quick note about funding, because as we have extensively covered thus far, open source does not necessarily mean free, and there are grant options out there to consider when getting any sort of collections management system, even if it is open source. So for that, check out the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS. The National Park Service also has some great technology grants. National Endowment for Humanities, and the Council on Library and Information Research, or CLEAR, among others. There are several others to check out. And then at the state level, I definitely recommend checking out the Library Services and Technology Act grant, or more commonly known as LSTA, as well as any local sources you might have available to you. And then I have a ebook that is available for free, courtesy of Lucidea, that you can go and grab. And then Lucidea and I just recently released a grant writing toolkit that includes not only a grant directory for grants that can help support digital projects and CMS, but also 4 different templates to use for your grant application, one of which is for asking for money for a collections management system. So definitely go grab those and make your job easier. More free resources available. These are the ones that I always have available, and these links will be in the email that you get tomorrow. Many more about webinars and courses, link to the grant writing toolkit, any other sort of webinars, and for mine that show up on YouTube, my YouTube channel. And if you've not signed up for my newsletter yet, I publicize all webinars to that community first. So if you are not on there yet, make sure you get on there if you're interested in doing more. And I do have some questions I'm going to dive into in a moment. But this particular slide has my contact and connect information. You do get a copy of this slide deck in the link you'll get tomorrow, the email you'll get tomorrow with links. You should also have a copy of this slide deck from today. So go grab those if you haven't already. And with that, I got some great questions from the group. So thank you so much for sending those in advance so that I could give some thoughtful and hopefully thorough answers for you. And the first question is, when should an archivist hire a developer, and when should they go it alone when deciding how to configure a system to specific needs? So I know we did chat about this as part of the webinar, but just to reemphasize, if you have the time, expertise, and interest in open source products, then the do-it-yourself approach can be successful. But if you lack even one of those 3 things, it's going to be a challenge for you. And that doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't do it, but you do need to be aware that that is a consequence of making that choice. So just keep those in mind. Next question. If the organization doesn't have any technical experience implementing an open source CMS, should we hire a tech consultant or service to implement for us? And the short answer here is yes. And I know we did go over some of this in the webinar, but to reemphasize, if you don't have, again, those 3 things, time, expertise, interest, then it's going to be a challenge for you. And ultimately, it'll make everyone happier and more successful by bringing in that outside help. So my advice to you is advocate for and get a budget set up ahead of time to hire those experts, whether it's a hosting company or consultant, to come in and help. Next question. What are the job titles or types of companies that would implement an open source CMS? So job titles could be a variety of things. The most frequent ones that came to my mind: web developer, open source software engineer, coder. You essentially need somebody who has the knowledge and background in doing web development with coding. So they not only need to know best practices of like digital usership and web presentation and design, they also need to know what a database is, how to code for a database, and have be able to code functionality for you for that database. So you're looking for a couple different areas of expertise here for these experts. For companies, you're looking for open source hosting and services. So for open source hosting, that could be the Lyrasis example that we gave. Library Host is another big one. But you're looking for a company who does does open source hosting, and especially if they do it for those particular products. So for example, in my my tip, um, no matter company or person, ask for a portfolio and examples, but also try and find someone or a company who has worked with that open source product before, because you do not necessarily want to be the client who is paying the consultant or company to learn a new product. That will cost more. So finding somebody who already has that experience with that product is much more preferable for you. Question: if we take an open sourced CMS, implement and customize it, do we legally own it and can sell access to it or versions of it to customers? So first of all, just a disclaimer, I am not a lawyer, asterisks. So call a lawyer for formal lawyer advice on this. However, I can confirm that I have seen examples of companies taking open source code and either selling services to host or service that code without changing it, and or selling a product that was built on top of open source code. So there are definitely examples out there where it can be one or more open source platforms involved that create a foundation to a proprietary product. So in those cases, and again, call a lawyer, but that is a transformation. And while you are using open source code that you don't own, you are creating a new product from it. So I've seen it done, and I'm very curious to see what your use case is. I would love to learn about it, but that is what I have seen, and that is my suggestion, especially if you are looking at selling versions of it. You should definitely work with a lawyer on that. Question: is an open source CMS safe from hacking and outside manipulation? Is it more vulnerable due to its source code being publicly available? And this is a great question. So, another asterisk here, while I'm definitely knowledgeable of this area, I am not a risk expert or a cybersecurity expert. So definitely consult with one of those. But essentially, any product you get, whether it's proprietary or open source, they all have vulnerabilities. The vulnerability of open source is that the source code is available. However, if it is a healthy product, if there is a robust community, if you're keeping your instance of that product up to date with any sort of updates and security patches, you can do things to limit your risks. So make sure you follow those, you do the updates, monitor security breaches. One of the benefits of doing open source is they're usually very transparent with the community of any sort of risk or breaches that may be happening. So it's something that you can keep an eye on. And so for here, be aware of it. That's, I think, probably just half the battle. You have good cyber hygiene in terms of making sure products are up to date. But essentially, just know that whether it's open source or proprietary, there are always going to be security risks. So I don't necessarily think one is safer than the other as long as you're practicing good cyber hygiene. All right, so that was the end of the pre-submitted questions. I know we still have some time together, so I'm going to leave this slide up and I'll be in the chat for an additional 10 minutes. If you weren't able to use the chat or you want to send me a question via email, you're free to do that, consulting@rachelchristine.com. And thank you so much for joining me on this webinar. It was a fun one to put together. I even learned some new things, and the questions that you sent were very smart and insightful. So thank you so much for those. They were a pleasure answering them. So I'll see you in the chat, and otherwise, thank you so much for being with me here today.